So nowadays, 70% of America wants civil rights protections for queer people. We can speak now because now we won't be fired from our secular jobs. We won't be denied adopting our kids. So we're coming out and we are speaking about the abuses, and the religious right is terrified.
Hi, this is Frank Schaeffer, and you are watching with me and my guests live on Facebook, and or listening to this as a podcast, and or watching this on YouTube and many other online sites. Today, I am talking with friends who I met in a very interesting way, and I will let them introduce themselves in a moment. But Paul Southwick and Tiffany Kimmel first came to my notice because they're making a documentary together, which we will be talking about. And they asked me if I would be a guest on their documentary. They came out here to shoot, and we sat down and we talked and we hung out a little bit. And by the time it was all done, I was very involved in their project in two ways. First of all, unless I'm completely edited out and wind up on the cutting room floor, as we used to say in the movie business when we actually made movies, you will see me in this documentary. But my real interest in this documentary now is the message of these films and what Tiffany and Paul are doing. I find it an immensely interesting project, and we will get into that. So Tiffany, before we go into the movie and before we talk about the content of it, let me just talk to you a second in terms of personal stuff, as in you're sitting in California. I think, Paul, you're in Oregon. Tiffany, tell us a little bit about your own journey to this moment in terms of your filmmaking, your writing, your documentary making, the position you have in this project. And why don't you start by giving us the current working title of your film project? What is the title of this film project?
So the film is called Exempt on God's Campus. And it is sort of representative of the religious exemptions that exist that Christian colleges and universities are able to use while still receiving federal funds in what we hope to show is somewhat discriminatory towards, well, not somewhat, it is discriminatory against the queer students on their campuses. And so we kind of wanted to highlight this issue and show that it's a separate, not equal system that is taking advantage of something that was created to basically preserve ideals that unfairly target individuals. So that's
Now, Paul, you bring something else to this table because you're Tiffany's producing this, and I won't try to juggle titles here, but Paul, you're the kind of executive producer in charge of everything guy, but you're also a lawyer who's bringing cases that defend and or sue on behalf of people in the LGBTQ community, on behalf of them for discrimination they suffer in colleges. So why don't you tell me a little bit about the project from that point of view of just how you got to this and what it is about?
Sure. Thanks, Frank. And as with Tiffany, I grew up in a fundamentalist evangelical homeschooling community in rural Oregon. I now live in Portland, Oregon with my husband, Greg, and Tiffany lives in Los Angeles with her spouse. But we originally started life off together in this little small homeschooling network. We were members of the Church of the Nazarene, grew up on property, and so wandering the country, reading the Bible, and pretty much reading the Bible for every subject that we studied, including science. And we were raised with a very homogenous group of people. And at least for myself, I think Tiffany veered off as the bad child a little earlier than I did, at least publicly. But for myself, I was a committed culture warrior. And Frank, your father was a hero, hero for me, for Tiffany, for our homeschooling community. We read the books, we watched the tapes, we bought it hook, line, and sinker. And I grew up in the right to life movement, the anti-gay movement. And then I was at a Christian college, a small liberal arts campus. There are about 200 Christian colleges in the United States today that explicitly discriminate against LGBTQ students. I went to one of them. They are allowed to promote ex-gay therapy. I was subjected to the ex-gay therapy. They bring speakers on campus that tell you that your identity and your relationships are perversions, that you might be a pedophile, that you probably were abused. And they send all of these very confusing, damaging messages, and they're doing it on the taxpayer dollar. Well, turns out that I was a homosexual myself, and I no longer could stand, lying to myself or hurting myself. It was really self-abuse that I've been funneled into. And I went away for law school at University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and I met a completely different world, a world where there are Christians who affirm LGBT people, a world where there are a lot of non-believers who are ethical, good people. And I learned to accept myself, and in the process kind of came back fired up and wanting to hold my abuser accountable. And I think ultimately that's what Tiffany and I are doing. The larger picture is that some of these fundamentalist communities, they enable abuse in a variety of ways, whether it's sexual or physical abuse, or abusing LGBTQ folks, or really denying you access to an education that you need to go on in life. There are a number of abuses. And so our project is really to bring accountability and shine a light on some of those.
Just to go back a little bit, were you, while you were out on the anti-abortion circuit, and when you were, an activist on the Christian right, as it were, a good culture warrior, was there a stage in that process before you came out where you knew you were gay, and yet you were still in this mix? And I ask you that because there was a time when I knew I was done with the evangelical right. But I stuck around for a few more years because I was earning my living there, and really bastardized and prostituted myself, not for long, but I had a wife and 3 little kids and no other way to earn my income. And then finally I made the plunge and I got out completely. And it cost me a lot in relationships and in income and all the rest of it. So in the end, I kind of redeemed myself a little by being willing to pay the price and get out. But there was a transition period when I knew perfectly well I was done with this movement. And in addition to selling the wrong message and continuing to sell the wrong message, sort of fake family values, all the things you're talking about, I was also indulging in a level of hypocrisy that I look back on now with great shame. And I don't know whether you have any parallel experience on your way out.
Well, as you're talking about that, I'm getting all of these images and memories of that period of my life. I would say, there was a period where I was still a true believer, but I identified as struggling with the sin of same-sex attraction.
Yeah.
And I would say in that period, I didn't view myself really as a hypocrite or as acting outside of the values that I was taught, because I was really trying.
Yeah.
But after 2 years of conversion therapy and that failing, and then me moving to Ann Arbor to go into law school, I, kind of like you were saying, I was so plugged into the religious right. I mean, that's where I did my jobs. That's where I did my internships. All my mentors, everyone who wrote me letters of recommendation, they were from that community. And you can't really go from that to anywhere in secular society very easily. So where it really, where I was kind of living duality was I was dating a liberal progressive woman who was not a Christian while in law school. I was still holding to my Christian beliefs, but they were starting to shift. But I'd already accepted a position as a legal fellow for the hate group Alliance Defending Freedom. And I showed up with a secret, which was a girlfriend that I was sexually active with. She was working at the ACLU of San Francisco.
Yeah.
Kind of the polar opposite of the political and intellectual spectrum. And I was
Sure.
having secret correspondence with her about how I'm not really gay and how, I love her and I'm committed to her and I'm at this hate group, but I really don't believe all the hateful messages, but I am stuck and I'm trying to hang on to what I do believe in. Well, that didn't work. I had a just complete emotional breakdown. I had to call a suicide helpline while I was at this fellowship, and a mom, a really kind mom, showed up in a white van in a parking lot, brought me in, and she just hugged me. And she said, "Paul, I love you. God loves you." And that moment, I knew I couldn't fake it anymore.
Yeah,
And
you're done here.
I left from that moment on. I left the religious right.
Let me back up a little bit with you, Tiffany, because you have a sort of a coming out story too, in the sense that you and I share that homeschool background. You and I have become really good friends. And let me just interject here that I owe Tiffany a lot here. Maybe like The Godfather, someday she will call it in, because this day may never come, but when it does, I'm going to have to pay up, Tiffany. I don't know if it's to embalm a relative of yours, like the Godfather scene, or bring you a cake of some sort. But I do owe you, because one of the things that was happening when Paul and Tiffany were here shooting is that I was also working on this book of mine that you see the poster in the back of, that'll be out in November. We're not going to talk much about it, but fall in love, have children, stay put, save the planet, be happy. And Tiffany, it's interesting, you came late to that project, but I sent it to you and said, what did you think? And I got back pages and pages of notes, some of the best comments I had. And I actually had to go back and rewrite the entire introduction to the book because I was so influenced by what you were saying. You're one of those people that just sparked a moment. You talk about, creative angels or muses, whatever, you showed up at the right time, and you had a huge impact on me and on the book. And I quote you in it. I thank you in it. I steal some lines from you in it where I do not credit you, but I just sort of palm them and put them in my pocket and use them. But you show up everywhere. So first of all, big thank you to you. But now, having said all that, let's go back a second and just talk about, here's Tiffany being homeschooled. And all of a sudden, here you are producing this movie for Paul. There's a big journey there spiritually. If you want to just talk about that, I'd be grateful.
Absolutely. Well, Paul is my brother's age, so a few years older than I am. And he and Lucas went off to the idealized Christian college that we'd all sort of set our sights at, George Fox. And I had the benefit of actually watching a little bit of their experience from a younger age. And looking
Yes.
and thinking, I don't want to go to chapel 3 times a week.
Mm-hmm.
Why would I want to do that? I go to church 5 times a week. I only am allowed to work at church. I only do things at church or school. It's like, I kind of don't want to do that. Can I figure a way out? And so I convinced my family to let me go to a public university, basically, again, following the Francis Schaeffer model of saying, I want to be a lawyer.
Yeah,
And
so I'll just interrupt you and Paul here and just say, blanket apology. I'm sorry, my family completely destroyed your lives or helped in your oppression and suppression. Sorry. Okay, keep going.
So I knew that I could convince them if I said I want to be a lawyer, or I think I want to be a lawyer. And I think the way to do that is to go into classics and, study Latin, Greek, and really pursue truth and knowledge according to the great books. And I don't know how well that really convinced anyone, but I also chose to go live at a small Christian school next to my public university.
Okay, so you still sort of had community support and you weren't going to be screwing around or anything.
Yeah. It was a homeschool religious tiny community that's very much tied into the same Blackstone Fellowship through other members, and it's a whole web. And so I was living there and going to the public university, and my break with evangelicalism came in sort of the form of having a very intense college relationship while my family was still bringing me home every weekend to attend church. And my friends were telling me all the best ways to be, and you need to keep your faith no matter what. And I was overwhelmed by school. I'd never been away from home for more than 5 days in my entire life, and I've been completely sheltered. Could not understand. I would go out in the street and just stay out all night because I had no boundaries with the world. I'd never been anywhere. So all of a sudden it's 3 a.m. and I'm in a cemetery talking to a physicist, thinking, I don't actually know if this is safe. Dear, what am I going to do? I can't tell anyone that I don't know anything. If I tell them that I don't know anything, they will make fun of me. And so I just faked it for so long. And that pressure and going through that relationship and it exploding terribly because I told him that he was going to burn in hell, and he had depression and suicide attempts and things like that. It just broke it all open for me, where I thought, I don't want to live like this. I don't want to tell other people this and believe it so fervently that they would turn that in on themselves and harm themselves, or feel like I was at all responsible for putting someone into a mental health crisis because of my own naivete. And so it just sort of started a journey of questioning things like, well, is what I believe actually valid if I'm saying that I love you, but I'm also saying that you deserve to be punished for all eternity for things that you might not be able to help? What does that really mean? And so that was sort of my moment of birth, as it were.
Let me backtrack a little bit to the film now and just talk about my take on this film, Paul and Tiffany, and then your take on it. When you all came out here and interviewed me, one of the things that I was pointing out and why I think this project you all are making is so important, and we'll get the name back again in a moment and plug it, even though it's a long way off, you're still working on it. But we are now witnessing the rise of a serious attempt by white evangelical Christians to impose a theocracy on this country. This goes way past gay bashing, misogyny, the abortion issue, all of these other things. It's another step. And of course, their poster child for this is Amy Coney Barrett, ironically, a woman who will be instrumental in rolling back Roe v. Wade and abortion rights when she gets the chance, who comes herself, by the way, Tiffany, out of a similar background to you and me, in that she was literally groomed as a child within a very weird little cult group. She's a conservative Roman Catholic, but that had evangelical influence, that have people who are literally called handmaids, who are over other women, telling them who they can marry, giving them permission for their relationships, all these sort of weird things that we've experienced in our own lives in ways. And the reason your movie is so important is because it's a story that fits in with a much bigger trend. And that is, it's not simply a matter of civil rights for people who are gay and trans and non-binary. It's a matter of actually drawing a line for everybody in our culture, saying, do we want an Iranian-style theocracy modeled on evangelical ideas that were pioneered by people like Rousseff Rushdoony and other Reconstructionists who said, we've got to bring America to the position of being like a new Israel, an Old Testament Israel, including the hanging of gay people, the imprisonment of women who have abortions, forcing women to stay home with their families and not have jobs. This is all for real, who had a huge influence. And so I want you to talk about your project again. Give us the title again. And first of all, Tiffany, give me a time frame. When do you think this project, and give me the title again, will be done?
Exempt on God's Campus.
Okay.
Our goal is to try and have something out before midterms next year. That's the hope.
Yeah. And Paul, don't you agree that your project represents far more than its subject? I guess that's a weird way to put it, but it's like more than the sum of its parts, because hey, context is everything. And the context of your project is post January 6th storming of the Capitol by a lot of people who were doing it in Jesus's name, and they haven't gone away. Talk to me about the wider context you see your project in, Paul.
Sure. And I have to thank Tiffany for helping me to see things beyond the immediate issues, because when I first started on this project with Tiffany, she's the filmmaker, I'm the lawyer and the activist, and so I defer to her on storyline and kind of how to see things. But she told me, Paul, you need to be ready for this film to morph, to evolve. It could end up being something very different from what you want to make. And I remember being like, Tiffany, stop saying that.
Well, let's start with what you wanted to make before it started morphing, and Tiffany came and blessed you or cursed you, whatever you consider it to be. How did you see it in the simpler terms before Tiffany showed up?
In the simpler terms before, Tiffany and then the rest of our team, and meeting you, Frank, was actually a huge shift in how we thought about it. But originally, I wanted to make a small film that would humanize the experience of queer and trans students on a Christian campus. So I was thinking, all right, let's find 3 or 4 students who will let us follow them around on their journey in campus for a year, the ups and downs, the secrecy, all of that, and show the world this community that's out there that most people have no idea about.
Yes.
What it's like to be on a Christian college in general. So that was my, kind of smaller thing. And then Tiffany, we had lots of conversations and was like, oh, well, this fits into a larger narrative. Oh, I'm like, I don't know about that. That sounds hard. That sounds outside of my comfort zone. But she kept pulling me. And then our director, Imran, had like, oh, there's this larger civil rights and religious liberties and how it relates to homeschooling and the evangelical right and all these different aspects. And then we meet with you, Frank, and I'll never forget it. And it's in the trailer that we're working on right now. It was something like I said, you told me that you're not just, I thought I was setting out to do something this big, like really small. Yeah. And you said, you're not doing that, Paul. We're talking about civil rights and a baseline of, do we have rule of law in America or don't we? Yeah. And I thought to myself, holy smokes, I am not prepared for this. It really challenged me to think not just about the film in that way, but about the movement that we're creating through the Religious Exemption Accountability Project, and how it relates to not only the insurrection, but also there are, the ex-evangelical community gets talked about a lot, but what I'm noticing is that particularly in homeschooling or fundamentalist private schooling, there are a lot of people like Tiffany and like me who are coming forward.
Yes.
And they're talking about the abuses.
Yeah, because Tiffany has a very deep insight, as you do, into that aspect of abuse. And again, it has a wider context, because up until Donald Trump, one could have assumed that the Supreme Court would have more reasonable people on it who would see that this tendency towards theocracy of the white evangelical movement had to be balanced against our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, our form of government. And of course, now with the Republican majority on the court, that balance is gone. And so we have a court that supports a theocratic vision up into, including, for instance, the right of churches to meet as epicenters of COVID over and above health concerns. They have the right to fire, if you're in a Christian college like Gordon College, a teacher that turns out to be gay, or ban a student from coming in. You have the right to deny women contraceptives if they're on your insurance plan, if you are working for a company that is owned or run by evangelicals or conservative Roman Catholics, whatever it may be. So now the funny thing is, I think, when did you start your project? Just throw a date out.
Well, we launched publicly in March, but Tiffany and I started 10 years ago,
Sure.
a very little version of this. And then about a year and a half ago, the more expanded version.
Yeah, and the direction since is going harder and harder towards a theocratic right, where the line is now being not only blurred between religious belief and the law, it's being eradicated by a right-wing Republican-appointed Supreme Court that is ruling again and again and again on the side of the right of believers to override the rights of other people within this democracy. And of course, you know, you have an even bigger template, and that is the number of evangelicals who are rejecting an actual democratic election result and saying that it didn't happen. As you sort of see a forerunner of how extreme could this be? Hey, that's how extreme it could be. So, you know,
and they're not stopping, Frank. They're not stopping. They're not stopping.
They're not stopping.
It's
so while you've been doing this, the ante has been up. So let me just get back to this point of about abuse within the homeschool movement, because Tiffany, I know you've thought a lot about this. The thing is, it isn't just, there's two kinds of abuse. There's the abuse itself, and then there's the abuse of the system, which uses religious liberty excuses to be abusive. So it's one thing that individual instances of abuse happen because we live in a world where there's evil. Mm-hmm. But if those individual abuses are then somehow protected by those who are supposedly are protecting a larger sense of justice, then you really have a problem. And it seems to me we're on the cusp of that, where the homeschool movement that is rife with abuse, whether it is physical punishment or other kinds of abuse, is being protected by justices who will always err on the side of the religious parent. That's my view. So Tiffany, can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, what's funny here is that we had just had a conversation with a writer and activist who came out of this homeschooling community, and he was pointing out that I can't remember the exact number, but it's something like 38 states.
48.
Well, was it really 48? It was so high. Most states in the US have basically deregulated home education to the point where you can be a sexual predator who gets released from prison and is allowed to pull your children out of the public education system and home educate them. Yeah. And there's no recourse, there's no protection, there's nothing. And they have worked so hard over the last 35 years to create such high parental rights that children, I mean, the Turpin case in California, where the children, I think there were children in their late 20s still chained to their beds at home. And no one had ever looked into this situation because the laws had been, completely gutted from within the system. So
and one of the best-selling books out of the evangelical community that has a whole lot of other little books that have come from it is this an author couple. I'm not going to name the book. I don't want to give it publicity, but that actually have chapter after chapter on methods of spanking. So when to use a wire coat hanger, when to use a belt, how to punish without leaving marks, how to spank a child into silence if they're crying. And this has been a bestseller in the evangelical community. And then Dr. Dobson with Focus on the Family years ago, talking about how he beat his dog with actually weirdly a woman's rubber girdle and gave it the beating of its life in the bathroom as an example that was of something that was good for the dog transposed into childcare, as in, hey, you got to draw the line here. And the only example he used was abusing an animal. So the history of abuse within the homeschool evangelical movement is not only there, it's not even hidden. There are best-selling books on how to beat a child. And nobody gets arrested. The books are on sale. There was a big protest a few years ago that I was part of, trying to get Amazon to at least stop stocking this book. and so on and so on. I'm sorry to interject that. It's so unpleasant, but I just have to say it. It's shocking. And now you have a Supreme Court majority ready to defend this on the basis of religious civil liberty, that how dare you tell a parent how to raise their child. It's their religious right to raise them as they see fit.
Well, one of the things that happens a lot with reparative therapy, that it comes directly from this sort of movement of parental rights over the child's to exist and be a separate being. You have these organizations. One of our producers had actually done a whole film while at Biola,
which is a Christian college.
Yes,
evangelical.
Kidnapped for Christ. And it was just sort of, she stumbled across this while doing a senior project. And here's an organization that exists in Haiti that brings in, teens and even college students that Christian parents are concerned about, and they take away all of your communication with the outside world, and they put you through reparative therapy, and you can be there for 1 month to 2 years. You could spend your entire high school experience, and you're basically held hostage in a foreign country, in a school that is telling you that everything about yourself is wrong. And this can apply. One of our childhood best friends was sent away to an anorexic camp, very similar, because it was a sin problem. And so she continued to be shipped around from facility to facility because these things were unacceptable to her parents and not scientifically based. It wasn't her struggle with mental health. It was very much God punishing her from within, or Satan tempting her to be this way. And so that level of extremism where you can take away someone's right to get a driver's license or leave home, it happens all the time, and it's invisible. And I think that's one of the things that the homeschool movement has allowed other groups to sort of glom onto.
Well, yeah, now, like I say, you have a court that will defend it, because they are always erring on the side of religious liberty, even in the most extreme examples, for instance, denying women contraceptive coverage. There is no limit to what they will now tolerate, as long as it comes packaged as a matter of religious liberty, whether that's the right to believe that you ought to have an AR-15 in your house and 1,000 rounds of armor-piercing ammunition, or the right to beat your child and keep them out of school in a cultic setting in which all their civil rights are abrogated. And then, of course, when you get to the gay child, you can hand them over to anyone to be reconditioned as a good Christian who no longer has this sin of homosexual temptation. So getting back to your project, Paul, there's a direct correlation, because it would seem to me that a lot of the young people struggling hardest, who are stuck in evangelical Christian schools or small Roman Catholic schools, whatever it may be, the folks who find themselves in this position, any of them would be suffering. But if you add into that they are born gay or they are non-binary people, then they have a kind of a double portion of persecution, the likes of which most folks in American culture probably don't even think exists. And certainly not in a legal framework where they don't have recourse. But they don't have recourse. They are stuck in these closed systems.
And there's been a lot of research in the last 10 years about the effects of stigma within your community and the minority stress that
Yes.
brings. And so they know that when you are a gay person or a queer or trans person in one of these fundamentalist Christian communities, that your likelihood of committing suicide skyrockets.
Of course.
And that's because the very family where most people do actually get positive psychological benefits from being part of a religious community. But when they studied that for queer people, they don't get it.
Yeah, and Go ahead. Sorry,
because when they're in that community that normally is a source of strength and belonging, but they can't belong because of their sexual or gender identity, that creates a complete disconnect from society,
Yes.
a hopelessness. And when you have no recourse, they're really, you can't go to the government, you can't go to your church, you can't go to your school, nobody's checking on you. What are you going to do? You feel lost and alone and terrified.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, a little while ago, we had a wonderful person as a guest on this quote unquote show here, which is me sitting at my desk looking at a cheap laptop and a little microphone here trying to be semi-professional. But anyway, Dr. Marlene Winnell, who's a fantastic counselor, psychologist, who has written a number of books, which people can resource by going to our podcast, our website, and so forth. And Dr. Winnell, Marlene, is someone I respect a lot, and she has studied across the board the traumatizing effect of leaving a religious community in any manner. But if you add into that the dysfunction that comes out of having your sexuality questioned and denied, on top of that, you know, I got my girlfriend Jeannie pregnant when we were 17 and 18 as a teenager in the liberties fellowship community that my parents were running. But that still sort of fit in with the parameter because we actually were in love. And so in the end, we got married, we had babies, we quote unquote did the right thing.
You could be forgiven of your offense.
I could be forgiven because, you know, there was plenty of this in the Bible. And unlike David, I didn't murder anybody. I just, you know, got her pregnant. But had I been born a gay male and had my quote sin and indiscretion been outed on that, then I would have had the option of either repenting publicly and changing my entire lifestyle, as they would have called it, like I could choose this, or, you know, really being an outcast on a completely different level. And so, you know, I don't think people understand that within the evangelical community, there are certain sins which are not forgiven, even though forgiveness is preached. And no matter what anybody says, being born gay is one of them. Increasingly, being born Black is sort of one, too now in the States. I mean, it's not officially so, but with the history of racism, that's always been there in the evangelical community. But I don't think there's anything parallel to what men and women and non-binary people suffer compared to everyone else who runs afoul of the evangelical system. And so I think your film is especially important to make this connection for people. So let me ask about some of the stories you're getting from people you're interviewing, not as commentators such as myself, but the people who you are following in the film, the students and others. Tell me about some of those folks and what you're learning.
Sure. I'll start with one, and Tiffany, if you'd like to chime in. Yeah. I think one of the really interesting plaintiffs is our, so we're focusing on a lot of the plaintiffs who are part of this class action lawsuit that I'm bringing. And the name of the class action is Elizabeth Hunter et al. Versus the US Department of Education. Mm-hmm. And Elizabeth Hunter, we chose to be what's called our named plaintiff, Hunter, for a variety of reasons. But I think that she exemplifies kind of these intersecting worlds of the rise of evangelicalism and the abuses that have occurred. And so what I want to say by that is, first of all, Elizabeth attends Bob Jones University. Now, when we think of religious exemptions nowadays, we think of them as being for contraception, abortion, or LGBT issues. But Bob Jones University really was the champion of religious exemptions. And what for? It was to preserve segregation.
Yep, I remember.
And to prohibit interracial dating and marriage.
Yep.
That's where religious exemptions started. They didn't start with gay people. They didn't even start with abortion and women. They started in racism. Yes. And the same groups who supported Bob Jones University in the 70s and 80s, advocating for religious exemptions for sincerely held religious beliefs about interracial marriage, those are the same groups that are fighting us on women and LGBT people today. So it's important to see that the broader movement, it's not just about gay people, like you said, Frank. It really is rooted in this white evangelical idea that government regulation is bad And the Bible tells us everything we need to know, so we don't have to follow man's law. And, you know, they've mostly left racism behind explicitly. There's still a lot of racism permeating that culture, but, you know, officially now they say we're sorry, we were wrong back then. And I think that as a result of our film, or as a result of our lawsuits, we hope that they will get to the place where they recognize that they were wrong about women and wrong about queer and trans people too. But we've got a big fight ahead on that one. So we picked Elizabeth.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because of this Bob Jones connection, but she was also raised in the foster care system. And evangelicals dominate the foster care services, in part, I think, because they have kind of fresh victims to essentially indoctrinate.
Well, they see it as a form of evangelistic outreach. We've got a chance to witness to these children and save them.
We got to witness to them and save them. And that means we are indoctrinating them in our home, in our homeschooling, and putting them. So Elizabeth was very much part of that. She grew up in the cult that the Duggars belonged to. And I can't remember the name of the religious tradition, independent something or other.
Yeah.
And she was not allowed. She was told that as a woman, your role is not to go to college. Your role is to be prepared to be a wife. Yeah. And she fought with her parents because she wanted to go to college. And so the only way she could go to college without being disowned by her family was to go to
her foster family.
Her foster family was to go to Bob Jones University, because they felt like that was the safest climate. And while she was at Bob Jones University with this history of racism, Bob Jones also, they found out that she was tweeting about LGBT issues.
Yeah.
Tweeting.
She was tweeting about Happy Pride Month.
Yes.
And people got a hold of that. And she was advocating against sexual abuse. And people were, this was during the Kavanaugh hearings, and women coming forward with allegations of abuse, and her classmates were making fun of the women, and she stood up for those women. Yeah. And as a result of standing up for women, we've had other plaintiffs too, just attending the Women's March or attending a Black Lives Matter march. They get called in, and then they get their whole private lives investigated. And if they are found to be either sexually promiscuous, as they would say, or LGBTQ, then they will be punished. So Elizabeth was grilled for 3 hours alone in a room. Are you a lesbian? Are you a homosexual? Here's another tweet. Did you write this tweet? Are you a lesbian? They tried to get her to say that. She said, she was very clever. She said, well, I think I might be asexual like Apostle Paul. And that was her way of sort of not having to date in the traditional heteronormative way. Well, you know what? They punished her anyway. They stripped her of all of her
and
job.
what year was that going on?
This was the year
2018.
What was this, 2019?
Yeah, so I just want my listeners, and by the way, you're listening to Frank Schaeffer on a podcast or watching on Facebook or YouTube. And this is Conversations with Frank Schaeffer, and I'm talking with Paul Southwick and Tiffany Kimmel, Tiffany Kimmel, sorry. And we are discussing a film project of theirs that is following these civil rights battles. But I just want to, having said that, note to everybody that we're talking 2019 here. This isn't 1953. You know, this isn't segregated lunch counters. We're talking now. A young woman being hauled into the administration and grilled for 3 hours with no representation. Are you a lesbian? Did you write this tweet? And this is perfectly legal because in the US, our Supreme Court and our Congress and our Senate defend religious liberty, quote unquote, to the level where there are really two citizenries in America. There are those growing up in evangelical and conservative Roman Catholic, or for that matter, conservative Muslim communities with that wink at young married teenagers, or, you know, even worse things, honor killings and all the rest, where we've got a country that is very, very sympathetic to, quote, religious rights, not so sympathetic to individual rights, never has been. So it's not a coincidence that Bob Jones is still up to its old games. When in my lifetime as a child, there were people coming from Bob Jones University to L'Abri Fellowship, amazed that my dad did not ban interracial dating. They thought that this was just part of the evangelical thing. My father was not a racist. And so they were surprised and somewhat shocked that he was so liberal compared to other things. But sadly, the direction of the country is back in this theocratic direction. And again, I can't say this enough. We have a Supreme Court that is sympathetic to this type of abuse, as long as it's presented as religious liberty. So Tiffany, can you think of another good example to talk about in terms of one of your interviewees that you're following their story?
I think one in particular that comes to mind, her name is Joanna Maxim, and she was a student at Fuller Seminary. And Joanna is an older student, and she was married for quite a long time to a man. And then while at school, or maybe even a little bit before, described falling in love with her best friend and leaving her husband and starting this new relationship and marrying her best friend. And at the time when she was entering seminary and participating in all these things, it wasn't ever a secret. She's a very open, warm, loving person who very much wanted to, study more about her faith. And her classmates knew about all these things, and even her FAFSA, it lists out her partner. And through a series of sort of targeted moves, they basically called her and put her on a warning notice. And Paul, you can jump in here because I feel like I might fudge details in my excitement. But basically, they said you're on notice for your lifestyle choices. She was like, I've been very upfront about this the whole time of what I've gone through, who I am, my identity. And then it was, the next phone call was, you can't come back. And, being so close to the end of finishing, being a believer, having felt like the community was supportive, and to have an administrator basically say, yeah, but, you're married to a woman and that's against our lifestyle conduct policy, and we can't support you, and we can't let you graduate. And that story comes up again and again.
So they take away her academic achievement. But I just have to point out for viewers who might not, and listeners who might not know this, Bob Jones University is on the extreme right. Fuller Theological Seminary is supposed to be the more liberal institution. So that when I was a child growing up, my father found Fuller very suspect because they were too liberal. They didn't have a good inerrant view of scripture. They allowed people to teach who would question a little bit. So if that's what Fuller's doing, if you understand my meaning here, then you can only imagine what the more conservative institutions within evangelicalism are doing. So what's her situation today? Did she ever get a degree? Did they toss her out before she was able to achieve that? What's her situation?
So Frank, she was there for 3.5 years, paying tuition. She only, I think, needed 6 credits to graduate.
Yeah.
They expelled her immediately.
Yeah.
She appealed and begged. She begged them, Frank. She said, please sit down for coffee with me. I'm not a bad person. Just let me finish my degree. I only have 6 credits. They said no. They wouldn't offer to sit down. They wouldn't offer. She has not graduated. She's working. She's a mother. So she's married to a woman. They have a child. She's raising the child. She's a working mom, and she is paying the federal government back for loans that she took out to an accredited taxpayer-funded institution that now she has no degree.
It's unthinkable. It's unthinkable. And how is that? Are these suits bundled as one class action, or are they sort of being treated individually as well?
So it's interesting, Frank. The case that I first had was against Fuller before this class action, and it was on behalf of Joanna and then another student who, when we filed Joanna's lawsuit, he said, me too. Fuller did that to me too. Can I join the case? So then we had 2 plaintiffs. And then I started putting together this class action because I saw, Frank, this is happening all over the country.
Yeah.
So I went around the country meeting with all these different kids from a variety of fundamentalist schools, and we filed our class action. And Joanna and Nathan are also part of that. But now we have these two big cases going, Frank. We've got the one against Fuller Seminary, which is against a specific institution. And then we've got a class action against the federal government. Well, now that we are exposing through these lawsuits and through the documentary film, we are for the first time in a very big way exposing the damage that comes from allowing religious institutions to act as though they are above the law.
Yes, absolutely.
And there are real people who have been quiet for a long time, Frank, because, you know, when your dad was really active and this religious right was getting going in the 70s and 80s, there were gay people back then being hurt too, but you didn't hear about it. Why? Well, America didn't like gay people in the 90s. You know, nobody liked us. Why are they coming out now, Frank? They're coming out now. And why even though we've got a bad Supreme Court, why I think we can win through our movies and through our lawsuits is because the United States in general and the American public, who are not part of this small fundamentalist community, the American public realized that what we did to queer and trans people for decades was wrong. And that they have brothers and sisters and kids and they care. So nowadays, 70% of America wants civil rights protections for queer people. We can speak now because now we won't be fired from our secular jobs. We won't be denied adopting our kids. So we're coming out and we are speaking about the abuses, and the religious right is terrified.
Yeah. And the thing is, you're asking a very basic question. And that is, and you know, we've been saying this throughout this conversation, but it's worth repeating. This is not primarily about one kind of civil liberty. This is about everybody's civil liberties.
And you know what shows that, Frank? I haven't told you this. The attorneys general of 15 different states, all Republican controlled, they filed a brief in my cases, Frank. Why would the attorneys general of Alabama, Montana, all these different states, why they don't care about these little tiny colleges affecting some queer and trans folks? They're intervening to send a political message that as Republican attorneys general, we are protecting our base of evangelical Christian conservatives. We are flexing by saying, you know, why are they spending taxpayer money filing in my case? 15 attorneys general. And then you also have got the Christian Legal Society. We now have Campus Crusade for Christ. All of these organizations are filing amicus briefs in my cases. Against you. Against me. Against my plaintiffs.
Yes, for the right of Fuller Seminary to deny your degree because you might be a lesbian, or for Bob Jones to toss you out on your ear because you have tweeted a gay pride endorsement or whatever it may be. You know, the thing is, as the general public finds out about this, of course, you will have public support. But when you realize that the Supreme Court has just underwritten kind of a resurrection of Jim Crow and voter suppression, and given unlimited dark money the ability to influence American politics and unleash people like the Koch brothers and so forth, and this was when they weren't even completely in the majority, you know, I think you're right in terms of the public sentiment. But I would also point out to people that I lived in South Africa for a year while it was in before apartheid ended and Nelson Mandela was let out of prison. And there you had a tiny minority of people who, again, actually in the name of Reformed Calvinistic Christianity, said that Black people were not fully human and could be oppressed this way. You know, we've seen in history before, if you went to Iran right now, most people would not want their ayatollahs dictating everything about their lives and killing people and so forth and so on. The idea that somehow that if you get enough public support, this will resolve, I'm not sure I'm that optimistic. I think that in the long term, it may, but I also think you have a massive fight on your hands because these special interest evangelical white supremacist folks realize that they've got a whole edifice here of churches and schools and these other things, all of whom will be threatened by the idea that the rule of law applies to everybody. Because in that case, they lose their authority and their ability to manipulate lives, whether it's the homeschool movement or anything else. So I think you have a fight on your hands. I mean, how do you see that? And something from
well, and they've gotten drunk on power. They've never had more power than they have now. I mean, they've got the court. They don't have the presidency, but they have enough senators that they can stop any civil rights or voting act legislation. So it's a really scary time right now. But I think when it's a scary time, Frank, you know, some people in the movement were scared of what I'm doing and what Tiffany and I are doing. Because they think, oh, this is not the time to go after the religious right, because we need to just hang on to the little victories that we have had in secular spaces. But I say, no, this is the time to go full throttle and to not back down and to say, this is who has power. This is why they have power. And there are ways to stop it. Are we going to? Are we going?
And this is what they do to real people.
This is what they do to real people. And real people who you probably know. And it's not just here and there. It is, and it's not just schools. It's not just foster care. It's also hospitals. It's homeless shelters run by Christian nonprofits turning trans people away from soup.
Adoption agencies.
It's adoption agencies. They have created this separate world where the Bible rules, and it might be fine if it was just a very small, like, little community in one spot where everyone is part of that community and it's not really interacting with the outside world. But no, they want to interact with the outside world. They are bringing outsiders to their colleges, to their hospitals, and then denying them their basic rights.
Or bringing foster kids into homeschool homes where they're cut off from all civil protections, including even against violence.
Correct.
I mean, it is a closed system and it's very oppressive. Tiffany, let me just get back to you for a minute here. How do you see this project that you and Paul are working on as sort of another step in your own journey away from that homeschool background and kind of out into a larger world? How has just this project alone changed the way you're looking at things for yourself personally?
Well, I think it's easy when you grow up inside of these communities to sort of lose your perspective and your own sense of self. There's a lot of enmeshment that occurs in a community, and, you know, being raised in a home environment where what your parents believe, even if they're wonderful, good people, whatever they believe, is the only thing that you see. And then whatever other experience you have is through the books. But you have is 85 to 90% of homeschool material is evangelical propaganda. I'm just gonna say it. Because most of these Abeka books and things have very specific political, religious points of view that are unapologetic and repetitive. You don't learn critical thinking skills. You don't learn how to actively speak up for yourself. Whatever the issues that your parents have or the issues that you will have to face because you don't know anything else. And so entering the world and working on a project like this and then seeing how that has manifested itself in so many other people's lives, and seeing how, you know, the reason I would argue that people should go to public school is not because public school is wonderful and that it's going to solve problems, but it's going to force you to interact with other people who are different from you. And the tension and the struggle of that is what creates a better democracy. Being forced to see other and not be afraid of other, you know, it's important. You might not feel comfortable, but that doesn't mean that someone else is wrong or does not deserve to exist. And sort of learning that where your rights end and someone else's begins, that there is a distinction and that you don't need to enforce and control someone else to be who you are and to live a good life. And I think that's been such a really interesting part of this journey, sort of recognizing I don't have to feel bad for existing and being different and wanting things that were not sort of preordained for me by God and my parents, but in a sense, figuring out, who am I? What do I want? How do I fit into this? And how do we also help other people do the same? And I think that's why I resonated so much with your book, was this idea of learning, just the concept of learning to be present in your own life and happy in your family, and to build something that is yours. And it's so critical to that process.
Well, listen, I will let that be the last word, and not because you talked about my book that'll be in bookstores November 2nd, but it's a wonderful place to end it, this Finding Your Own Voice. Paul and Tiffany, thank you so much for coming and talking with me. I'm honored to be part of your project. I can't wait to see the trailer, such as it is, when you've got it together. Keep me posted. Let me know how I can help promote it. And we will keep following it. We will do another one of these discussions a little while from now and check in on how it's going. So thank you so much for being here today, giving us a little bit of your time. Much love to both of you, and we will be in touch soon. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank.
Thank you.